Well, good afternoon and welcome to the session Trade and Climate Change, What is at Stake of Developing Countries. Today's event is organized by the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica and the World Bank Group. I'm Gloria Abraham, Ambassador of Costa Rica to the WTO, and it's a great pleasure to moderate this discussion. The adaptation to climate change will be the defining element for the subsistence of our populations. While developing countries are among the most vulnerable to climate change, they often lack the capacity to adapt to implement measures that reduce emissions without compromising the critical dual policy objective of economic growth and poverty reduction. Although we are used to talk about the challenges and trials that the most vulnerable commonly face, this afternoon we want to discuss the positive and optimistic side of this equation. We will not disregard the difficulties developing countries encounter, since Costa Rica itself faces its own deal of obstacles. However, I believe the opportunities flourish from the crisis, and we have plenty in front of us. To understand where these prospects may be, we have an impeccable panel of experts to guide us. I will optimize the short and valuable time we have, and we'll start right away by giving the floor to the panelists in the order established in the agenda. Each panelist has 10 minutes. You can consult their bios and in the link dedicated for this event in the Public Forum's website. I will start with Paul Branton, who will present the World Bank's report on the nexus of trade and climate change. Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Let me just see if I can share my screen. While we wait, I think I've never been called impeccable before, so that's quite a nice introduction. Can you see my screen?
Nope.
Okay, let's try again. How does that work?
Yes.
Great.
It's okay.
Okay. So thanks very much for this opportunity to present the main findings from our report on the nexus between trade and climate change, the many and difficult, complex ways in which trade and climate change interact. So I think our focus here is on developing countries, because developing countries are at the very heart of this nexus between trade and climate change. They are the most vulnerable and they have the least resources and capacity to adjust to climate change. We know that the climate is already changing. Temperatures are rising and rainfall is changing, and that's affecting crop yields and traditional export industries such as tourism. We also know that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent, and that's destroying export capacities and undermining traditional export opportunities. And also, we know that mitigation, developing countries have actually been growing fast and carbonizing, and so they are part of the mitigation story. But also will be at the heart of adaptation, and that requires more capacity, significant investments, and policy reforms. And this is an area we can discuss later, where the international community has a very important role to support the mitigation and adjustment that's required. Agriculture typifies the challenges that we see for developing countries from a changing climate. Climate change is going to make food security even more of a challenge than it already is. IFPRI predict that 70 million more people will be at risk of hunger by 2030 because of climate change. Malawi is a good example. It's dependent on rain-fed maize for its exports and most of agricultural production, and will be hit hard if without any other changes by climate change. Trade is also figures heavily when we talk about issues of land use change and deforestation. A lot of the deforestation we see is perceived as being as a result of land use change for export crops. And indeed, in regions such as Africa, most of the increase in output that we've seen in recent decades has been as a result of changing land use, while yields have remained stubbornly low. But here's an opportunity that if regions such as Africa were to achieve similar levels of agricultural productivity to the average of developing countries, then output could more than double. And that would considerably release the pressure on land in achieving the output that's required to feed populations. But to mitigate land use change and to adapt to changing climate, farmers need better technologies. They need new technologies. They need appropriate seeds and fertilizers, all of which can help both mitigation and adaptation. But in a world which is facing more uncertainty about output as a result of climate, trade becomes an even more important buffer in addressing the needs of hunger. And the issue of mitigation, to achieve mitigation and adaptation, access to new technologies and particularly environmental goods and services is critical. But barriers to these goods and services, barriers to trade these goods and services still remain. Tariffs on environmental goods are often higher in developing countries than in other sectors. So the average tariff on environmental goods in Brazil, for example, is over 10%. So environmental goods are things that are goods which actually help deal with the climate crisis. Renewable energy is the most obvious one in terms of solar panels, wind turbines, etc. And in many countries, tariffs are raising the price and reducing the availability of those goods, those essential goods. Tariffs on environmentally preferable products that are produced in an environmentally sound way relative to identical or competing products are of particular importance to developing countries as we transition to this low carbon future. Yet those products face higher tariffs on average. And there's a very important agenda for developing countries in improving market access for environmentally preferable products. But even when tariffs on environmental goods are low, non-tariff measures can be a significant barrier to trade. In many countries, these are not overt trade restricting, they're not put in place to restrict trade, but often reflect lack of capacity, the lack of technical capacity with regard to standards and conformity assessment for environmental goods and the technologies they contain. And finally, environmental services are part of this agenda. It's important to address restrictions on environmental services at the same time as environmental goods. That's because, as other authors have coined it, that if environmental goods are the hardware that we use to treat climate change, then environmental services are the software to make sure that those goods work properly. And yet commitments on services and environmental goods lag behind those in other sectors. But in this trade and climate change nexus, there's not only issues with regard to how trade policies affect the environment and access to environmental technologies, but also how measures to address climate change, environmental policies affect trade. And obviously one of the most talked about measures at the moment are carbon border adjustment mechanisms at the border to add a tax on the carbon content of imported goods in a context in which the country concerned or the region concerned is applying taxes on carbon within the region. At the same time, those measures raise fears about protectionism, that whether they're just being imposed as another means of restricting trade. So it's important to assess the nature and design and the impact of such measures. Our initial analysis of the EU scheme, a stylized analysis of the EU scheme, which is limited to the fossil fuels and a narrow range of very carbon intensive goods, shows that that those measures will impact fossil fuel exporters and exporters of carbon intensive products. And so there is a diversification agenda which becomes even more important. A trade diversification agenda becomes even more important for those countries. But these climate policies will actually shift demand. They will shift demand away from carbon intensive products towards other goods. And that creates new opportunities. Low carbon intensive exports will become more attractive, or new opportunities will arise in those goods. The EU scheme at the moment is pretty narrow, but if it becomes wider, or when it becomes wider, as some people would see, then the issues of how it will impact on developing countries become particularly important, particularly in the way it's designed and implemented. And the current standards, the way we measure the carbon content of products, needs to be adapted to reflect the realities of production and land use change in developing countries. At the same time, as governments are introducing or considering schemes with regard to that will impact trade, business is going ahead, and businesses are implementing their own measures to firstly show their own climate credentials. So, for example, Walmart has a project gigaton where it plans to commits to remove a gigaton of emissions from its value chains, and also the labeling of products so that consumers have a better idea of what the carbon footprint is of their purchases. Now, again, in these cases, it's very important that these initiatives reflect the realities of production in developing countries and allow developing countries to identify, demonstrate, and exploit carbon competitiveness, their own carbon competitiveness, where it arises. And so, again, these standards and how they're defined and implemented becomes very important. So what are there are also opportunities, in this transition. And I think that's an important thing that we want to discuss today and stress. And first, opportunities for job creation, for diversification away from traditional sectors, and job creation in new export sectors where countries are carbon competitive. Also, trade brings access to technologies that can drive mitigation, but also adaptation. And for example, in Bangladesh, we calculate that access to new green technologies would have a significant impact on the country's emissions over the coming years. And finally, developing countries need to have a seat at the table that defines the rules that will govern trade in this new low carbon future, and particularly those governing trade in environmental goods and environmentally preferable products. And here, the standards really do matter. And currently, the standards have been set primarily on the basis of information and experience in developed countries. And often, when they're applied to developing countries, default values are used because of a lack of information on developing countries. And we have one example here with regard to sugar, which when the worst case default value was used for land use change, it changed the calculation by almost 2,000%. So these issues of measurement and the use of default values can have really profound impacts on the calculation of carbon contents of products. And just then finally, to summarize, some of the policy measures that can enhance the role of trade in responding to the climate crisis. So I think a key point in this report is that while trade does contribute to carbon emissions, and it therefore is a factor in climate change, trade is also a very important part of the solution to climate change by making available new technologies, by facilitating adaptation. And that requires, at the country level, for countries to review their tariffs to the extent to which the current tariff is encouraging imports of dirty goods relative to clean goods, but also to remove barriers on environmental goods and services and environmentally preferable products. And given the challenges, the increasing challenges of food security, is to review trade policies and their impact on agricultural products. For the global community, it's important to ensure the participation of developing countries in the rulemaking regarding environmental goods and services, and the way that we identify the carbon content of products. Support, the diffusion of new green technologies, because these are critical for mitigation in developing countries. And agree on ways to shield low-income countries, in particular from export restrictions. This is something that we look at in the report. It's been a highly visible issue recently with regard to COVID and access to vaccines and essential equipment in hospitals. But it's also particularly important with regard to agriculture and in the response to a weather-induced crisis. Increasingly frequent extreme weather events are going to cause more and more crises in developing countries. And as part of that response in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, access to food and other essential products is critical. And so in ensuring that the countries can maintain their access through trade to those products is critical. And then finally, there is an aid for trade capacity building and technical assistance agenda to build the capacities of developing countries to fully participate in this transition to a low carbon future. So let me leave it there, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul, for your wonderful presentation. It's a very interesting perspective. Thank you so much. And now it's a pleasure to invite Ms. Sheila Aguargal-Can, Director, Economy Division of United Nations Environment Program, to tell us from her perspective what efforts are needed to address the climate challenge. How can trade facilitate them? The floor is yours, Sheila.
Thank you, Gloria. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and really very interesting to see some of the developments that have been taking place, especially, for example, Costa Rica's lead on the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. You asked about what we see as the key issues to addressing climate change. And I think most of you will say, well, that's a given. We've been talking about renewables, we've been talking about energy efficiency and all. But for us, I think the biggest challenge is how do we do that at scale? On the one hand, we've been talking about fossil fuel transition to clean energy. But on the other hand, we're seeing in the news, the situation in some countries where there are fuel shortages. Why? Because actually the pace of being able to transition to cleaner energy is not at the pace that we need. So how do we move to that kind of scale where we need to be able to transition out of fossil fuel into renewables at a much faster and larger scale? There's been all the talk from Paul just now on tariffs, and now we're seeing movements on carbon pricing. What we're not seeing is what will it mean to be able to meet countries' needs, their own different priorities, being able to respect common but differentiated principles. We've seen lots of work on infrastructure movements on this front, but at the end of the day, we're not seeing that much investment in sustainable infrastructure. So are we going to end up locking ourselves across the globe into infrastructure that'll either be obsolete or that'll harm us in trying to be able to meet the Paris Agreement? In 2019 alone, we saw fossil fuel subsidies at 500 billion across the globe. We saw agricultural subsidies in that same year at 540 billion. Are we able to repurpose these subsidies in ways that can address climate change, but at the same time be able to create jobs, income, and take care of the vulnerable? We're seeing growths in the digitalization space, electric mobility. It's going to increase the amount of resources that have to be extracted. But we're also seeing a growth in the way countries are looking at circular economy approaches. So how can we use this trend towards needing more mineral resources, but at the same time an interest in the circular economy, to be able to use the mineral sector and the mining sector to be able to contribute to greenhouse gas emission reductions? The key issue, of course, is going to be how do we do this at scale and at the same time addressing countries' priorities and making sure that it creates the kind of jobs so that we have a greener recovery that works for everyone. So as Paul mentioned, trade at the end of the day can bring lots of opportunities. We have the International Resource Panel that says that, well, 1/3 of materials resources are traded. And those materials back in 2017 alone contributed to 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Not talking even here about the biodiversity loss. So how do we move into a system where we see more circular economies that take advantage of having green supply chains? At the end of the day, we're going to need to be able to incentivize green trade. Paul talked a lot about environmentally preferential or preferable products, but on the one hand, we see tariffs in the wrong place and incentives in the wrong place. So it's something we're going to need to look at. UNEP produced a report recently on trade in used vehicles. And sadly, we saw only 28 countries out of about 146 countries studied had standards in place for the kinds of emission reductions that can come from used vehicles that get imported into developing countries. So we see a growth in actually emissions in this space when actually the trade could have been worked out in ways that could have supported emission reductions. So a lot has to be done. On a more positive note, we've seen Costa Rica, Fiji, New Zealand, Norway, and Switzerland come into an agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability acts, where they're going to be looking at regressive fossil fuel subsidies. So that will be very interesting, what will happen in terms of the fossil fuel policies that are in place. We're also seeing some very interesting partnerships coming together, for example, in the Climate Working Group on trade, environment, sustainability, structured discussions, TEST, and which is also looking at trade financing, green aid for trade, green recovery. We see these as very important opportunities for countries to be able to take on board the need to bring trade and environment sectors together, to work together. And with COP26 along in the next few weeks, let's say, it will be a very important space to have trade at a really key point in the discussions, because without trade and environment working together, the Paris Agreement is just not going to be met. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. It's a very interesting perspective. And now it's my pleasure to invite and to welcome now a fellow Costa Rican, Monica Araya, who has extensive experience in individual initiatives for the decarbonization. So you can tell us what are the implementation challenges of the low carbon transition, particularly with regard to the decarbonization. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the previous speakers, because my presentation will complement what you said. So I suspect we'll be in agreement in this panel, and we will. Our task will be to bring it down to very specific ideas, given that I don't expect us to have a big, controversy. So as you know, Costa Rica has been a small country with very big ideas, and you know very well that when it comes to environment, it's very active, often punching above its weight. And then when it comes to trade, it's also very active. It's a strong believer in the WTO. It has a very professional Ministry of Trade. So the point is that to some degree, I am a product of that peculiarity, for a small country. So before I get to decarbonization, the first point I'd like to make is that my first job as an economist was in the Ministry of Trade, working on environment more than 20 years ago, when this topic was very unusual for a developing country in particular. So one of the things I'd like to make today, or like to say, is that we now have time to think about what has changed in this very important trade and environment debate that is not new, but was dormant for quite a few years. And one of the main things that has changed is, of course, the climate emergency. But the point is that when I was working on this, there was no Paris Agreement. So we did not have 200 countries agreeing that we have to build a net zero resilient economy. Whether these countries, each of them, believe this is true and is committed, that's a separate conversation. The point is that we agreed that. And the question that we have to have, the responsible question that we have to bring to each of our countries is, how do we make it work? In other words, the main shift that I have seen in many of the discussions is that we have moved from whether we have to combine objectives to how to do this. And that also applies to the climate negotiations. I was a climate negotiator, and I have seen a shift even with the most difficult partners, right? Because now the question is, well, how much are you going to reduce by when? So one very concrete insight that comes from Costa Rica, we'd like to say that, yes, we're small, we don't matter in the context of the G20 discussions, but we matter from the perspective of being a lab. Because if you think about it, if a country like Costa Rica that already has renewables, that is small, that is relatively stable, cannot decarbonize the economy and cannot increase its resilience, well, good luck with more difficult countries. So to some degree, many people have an incentive for the story of Costa Rica to succeed, given that is, as I said, is not easy, but is easier than in other countries. So what is it that Costa Rica did already from the perspective of a policy tool that is very helpful, is to have a national decarbonization strategy. Obviously, there is also something on resilience, we can talk about that, but for the purpose of these remarks, let's think about the fact that no matter the country, whether it's big or small, you have to know how you're going to get to net zero as soon as possible, but no later than 2050. You'd have to understand how you do that with your economy. And Costa Rica did that. We have a plan. You can download it. It's very easy to find it. And the exam question is, if we're going to be net zero by 2050, what does it mean for agriculture? What does it mean for transport? What does it mean for electricity? And then we did the backcasting. And then we did the workshops with people. And then we did the whole thing of trying to win the hearts and minds, because a lot of this is also about the mindset that some, especially economists, bring to the table. And the point is that if you look at that very early, I mean, that came out in 2019. Think about it. If you look, for example, at the pillar on agriculture, the language all the language that is there is coming from the perspective of agency, right? It's not from the perspective of, oh, we didn't create the problem, the big countries have to first get their act together and maybe then we're going to do something. No, it's totally written from the perspective of agency. And the one point on if you look at the 10 pillars, there are 10 pillars by sector. The one on agriculture is very clear. It says we have to have a successful agricultural sector, and that agricultural sector has to export to the world markets, and it has to be climate compatible, and it has to have these requirements, or not so much requirements, but these self-imposed conditions. And I find that this is very helpful because it reorganizes the question that the sector is going to be asking, is how do we succeed internationally, but how do we do it in a way that is compatible with climate? And our ambassador, who is moderating this session, deserves a lot of credit for this, because she was Minister of Agriculture, and she was Minister of Agriculture at the time where the ministry didn't deal with climate. So she was a pioneer in making sure that the sector itself asked the question of how do we succeed while also taking the climate seriously. If you look at the plan, at this or a strategy, you also have a very important economic points about what we need to mainstream if we are going to decarbonize successfully. For example, it talks about the critical need to change the way we tax in our country, because if we, for example, don't change the current system that basically collects taxes from gasoline, as we move to an electric mobility system, obviously the taxation is going to suffer, and we can't just pretend that's not going to happen. So that is the kind of thinking that is proactive and is also technical, because there have been studies about what to do about that. What I can tell you is that is very revealing that even though there is evidence that we have to decarbonize, if there is evidence that there are benefits, it's one of the things that I find that we really need to tackle head on is the nature of the economic conversation that we're having in the public domain. Because it is very interesting to me to observe that the decarbonization plan was still not main. It's interesting to me to observe that a certain generation of economists is still unable to grasp with the imperative that we have, and therefore did not, or made the choice of not taking the plan as an economic topic. They still saw it as a distraction from the serious conversation we have to have about the economy and how to grow. So I think one of the key challenges, and I would be very interested, for example, in Paul's or in Sheila's reaction about this, is how do we make sure that we really start shaking the architecture of our economic discussion? Because now with COVID, I still see this disconnection between what we're saying on climate and to some degree the economy from the perspective of the Paris Agreement, the decarbonization plans, and what the economic profession is still saying on the radio, is still writing in the newspapers, and is still teaching in our faculties. So that's a gap that I find that even in Costa Rica, where you would expect the situation to be greener from the perspective of economists, is a challenge. Then let me give you the exact number. One very proactive thing that Costa Rica did was to work with the Inter-American Development Bank and have a detailed study that came out in November 2020 that basically calculates the net benefits for the Costa Rican economy if it decarbonizes the whole, if it goes to net zero, not zero, is net zero by 2050, and it's $40 billion US dollars between 2020 and 2025, applying a 5% discount rate. So the point is that there has been an excellent approximation to having the benefits of this transition captured in very concrete terms. So that is not like, well, you know, it creates benefits for health, benefits for the economy, benefits for people. It's actually quite concrete. And yet, as I said, this is still not really entering the mindset of certain economies, and especially business associations. I think that is a universal problem. I don't think it's just for Costa Rica. So I also find that if you, for example, in this moment, if you ask me, what would you do right now with the export sector and climate in particular? Well, you know what I would do? I would do what we call in Spanish, la oferta exportable. You know, what we see as our main winning proposition for exports. We know who they are, the exporters. We know what the products are. There is a very sophisticated entity called Procomer. It's actually a fascinating case study of how a country is saying, we're going to win this, we're going to export successfully. I would personally take that list, la oferta exportable, and I would go product by product and start doing a column saying, how climate compatible is this from the perspective of vulnerability? Because I don't think the experts in Costa Rica, I mean, some of them might be, might have some environmental problems, but I think most of them, the situation they face is actually risk, you know, like because the country is so vulnerable to impacts, there is a big chance that our oferta exportable is actually more vulnerable to climate change than the exporters themselves have understood so far. So another very concrete thing that Costa Rica, and actually is something that the sector is already doing, is to look at the strategy to attract foreign direct investment. I don't know if you know this, but the agency that captures all this investment is very used to winning awards. It's very successful, even in the context of COVID and all these horrific things that have happened in Latin America. It was able to attract investment in the percentage in which some index calculated this, basically said Costa Rica has been able to attract investment under very difficult circumstances. And if you look at the team that is working, figuring out the best strategy, that team is very proactively looking for foreign direct investment that is green. We could have a conversation about what green means in this context. The point is that I find that this is exactly the kind of mindset that I still see missing in other parts of Latin America, where the trade conversation is still caught up in the idea that, well, climate and environment, it's a lot of technical barriers to trade. And you still see this kind of skepticism. So what is it that I would advise, maybe not the bigger and developing countries, because as we know, the reality of China, India, Brazil is something that is of a different order. But if we think about the layer of countries that are middle income, that are proactive on climate, on renewables, I actually think that this is the time to be idea shapers instead of idea takers. One of the lessons that Costa Rica learned is that by being proactive, for example, in the WTO, by being, unusual members of discussions on trade and environment, where other developing countries were kind of reluctant, one of the advantages of doing that is that you start being less afraid. You start being more proactive. You start chairing meetings. You start convening meetings. And in that sense, I do think that there is this renaissance of questions about trade and climate. I was very happy to hear the World Bank colleagues saying this. I mean, it's such an important player. And I do think that this is something that we hope will happen more in the next, say, 2 years, now that the WTO is signaling to the world that is just like the IMF, the World Bank, and other big organizations is trying to catch up with climate. Let me just end up by saying one thing about sectors, because my current job as advisor to several initiatives on climate is very focused on the acceleration of the end of the internal combustion engine, which is a completely different topic, but as we heard from Sheila, has very deep connections to trade. In that world of transportation, what I can tell you is a very promising idea, is the notion that the climate regime that is traditionally organized by countries, what is India saying? What is the US saying? What can we do to make sure that a country like China, that kind of debate, about the nation state is completely understandable because of the Paris Agreement. And yet we know it's not going to be enough to get us where we need to go. So one of the very important shifts, especially in the road to COP26, is that in addition to the national commitments, we need to have very, very, very big sectoral-based strategies. And what does that mean? Is creating the coalition of the willing. For example, in the case of road transportation, who are the countries that are going to stop saying from this year on, we will not sell any more petrol and diesel cars? Because they are bad for the environment, bad for health, and because there is something better that is getting cheaper and is there, doesn't have a tailpipe. So my point is that when you look at, for example, what is going on right now in the road to COP, you have, for the first time in the context of climate, a sectoral-based campaign saying, here's a ZEF, Zero Emission Vehicle Transition Council. Here's Drive Electric, bringing all the philanthropies of the world coming together. If you look at Drive Electric campaign, you will see all the foundations coming together with 100 partners, including UNEP, of course, 100 partners saying, there are all these problems, all these opportunities, we will take on board transportation. So my landing point with this insight that I've learned in the context of road transportation is that so many partners are coming together. There are so many opportunities for decarbonization and for very good things from the perspective of health. And yet, I think that one of the missing links is the trade component, as was mentioned previously. At some point, we're going to have to talk about stop the imports of second-hand cars in a place like, I don't know, Costa Rica, Colombia, and others say, well, that's not going to happen. Let's face it. We should start asking the question on when the countries are going to stop exporting them to the developing world. So it's not a settled discussion, but my point is very much at the cutting edge of climate action. And I find that opening up this space, Costa Rica, the WTO, the World Bank, UNEP, I think is one concrete example of sectoral-based decarbonization that can actually go to the next level if we integrate this trade dimension that is opening up more recently. And I welcome the conversation that we will have. Thank you so much for having me.
Muchas gracias, Mónica. Como siempre, extraordinaria en tus presentaciones. Muchísimas gracias. Our final panelist is a well-known face at the WTO and acknowledge one of the linkage between trade and environment. Ho Lim is the director of Trade and Environmental Division of WTO. And please, Ho, give us our views on the role of trade policy in meeting developing country adaptation challenges. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I mean, a lot has already been spoken of, and a lot has been laid out by Paul Brenton, by Sheila Agarwal and Monica Araya on the trade and climate change nexus. And originally, I had been thinking about speaking more on mitigation, but the question that you've posed is really much more on adaptation. And I think it's also fair to say that a lot of what I would have said on mitigation has really been addressed by Paul in terms of how trade can play a role. And Paul also spoke about how trade can play a role in adaptation. And as much as we need to, I think, and not just we need to deal first and foremost with mitigation. The reality is that, as Paul and others have said, climate change is here, and adaptation is clearly a very important part of the agenda. So here, looking more concretely at trade policy and trade and how can it help address adaptation challenges. Just to restate a little bit, we know that natural disasters cause a significant damage to low middle income countries. Sometimes different figures have been put together. Paul has shown you, I think, quite a lot of this in his report, and he's provided the estimates from something from 18 billion and going up to 390 billion a year if we consider wider disruptions to households and firms. So not to belabor the point, in all of this, there's the question of how do we help countries to adapt? And here I just want to come back to a very small point, which is that, but I think a significant point is to think of trade as always having played this role. Trade itself is a very powerful adaptation tool, and it helps cushion the negative impacts of climate change. And that role is actually not new. There's a very popular book by Yuval Noah Harari on Homo sapiens. although his book is not about trade, it's about the survival of humanity, and in that case, Homo sapiens. And he goes back and he talks about very interesting research by paleoanthropologists looking into what made it distinct for Homo sapiens. How did they survive environmental challenges and climatic challenges? And according to that research, one interesting point is they traded in the way that they did as small groups of Homo sapiens. And it was actually that trade which meant exchange of tools, exchange of food, and in some cases you could consider the tools to be technology, which gave them an edge over other groups that did not trade as extensively as Homo sapiens. And this is research, and of course not from trade or trade economists, this is research from anthropologists. And I found this fascinating, to think back about the role that trade has had historically. And intuitively, it makes sense, by diversifying your resources, by collaborating, by cooperating, and by actually making it more possible to deal with shocks. Now, if we, of course, take that example and move it more into the world we live in today, basically, it's thinking about supply chains, and it's about the role that supply chains play today. Maybe it's not so new. Maybe it's a very old role when we link it into the notion of trade. And here, of course, I'm using trade in a very broad sense of exchange between groups and different communities. And so if we take this premise, the role of trade in adaptation is actually very strong. And we don't need, of course, to go to Yuval Noah Harari or to paleoanthropologists for this sort of data or evidence. We can come to much more direct information, looking at how trade has played a role in dealing with global hunger, with dealing with other weaknesses due to sudden shocks. Some very interesting research shows that, if we actually look at agricultural trade, and if we remove certain tariffs on agricultural trade, we could have a very significant impact on reducing the impact of climate change on undernourishment. I won't throw very many figures, but I think this figure was really interesting from a study on global hunger and climate change adaptation through international trade, where they estimate that phasing out agricultural tariffs and implementing other trade facilitating measures could actually save some 35 million people from suffering from hunger because of climate change. And of course, one can quibble about methodologies, about figures, about the estimates, but I think it's an important policy point to think about. And I think it answers a bit as well as to the challenge of scale. We heard about the need to scale up. And again, trade is basically that instrument. It is the instrument for scaling up. And why? Because it connects again markets, it connects again resources, connects goods, connects services. And that's the whole purpose. It's the scale that matters. But of course, trade in itself is not automatic. It's not going to bring about climate adaptation or climate mitigation unless we frame it with the right policies. And I think that's what consistently has been said throughout the panel. And coming to this point, what are the right policies? And I think Paul's already illustrated quite a number. We could go deeper into some of these things, but in the interest of time, I won't go so much right now. But just to talk about a few things, one, of course, is lowering barriers to environmental goods and services. You can think about this in terms of those needed for adaptation, but as well as for mitigation. It's about addressing environmentally harmful subsidies. Some of these subsidies prevent the green transition, prevents the climate transition from taking place at scale. Some of these issues are currently already being addressed by WTO through the lens currently of the fishery subsidies negotiations. But it's a very clear direction of dealing with environmentally harmful subsidies. But of course, we're not yet there. We need to get a successful conclusion. And there are also things to think about climate proofing our supply chains themselves, the global trade and supply chains that I spoke about. Different ways of doing this, of course, but of course, a key part is investment and bringing in the capital and investment to do so, and to countries who need it. WTO has a small part, together with other agencies in this, through Aid for Trade. Aid for Trade is one instrument that could help to try to bring about more investment or to mobilize investments to critical supply side infrastructure necessary for green transformation. But Aid for Trade is really very small when you think about the global picture of climate financing. Some figures from 2013 to 2018 says that there's something like $65 billion dollars of Aid for Trade has already gone to projects with a climate objective. But even though 65 billion sounds big, I would argue it's still very small compared to what is needed and compared to the possible climate financing facilities out there. So one idea would be try to scale up the green component of Aid for Trade, try to develop more synergies with climate financing programs. And very lastly, Ambassador, I think what several speakers have already pointed to, what would give a push on impetus to work here at WTO? And I think some of this, you know very well already. It's, in part, it's members of WTO showing that they care, that they want to take action, and they want to shape trade policy in support of climate action. And that has to be done at the level of the members, and hopefully with more collective action between members, such as through the work of the structured discussions, for instance. And another way to think about it is to think about that discussion not stopping just at WTO. I often wonder, why don't we have more of this discussion in the climate change area? There are instruments that are trying to raise climate action, such as the nationally determined contributions, maybe not ambitious enough, but I know the objective is to make them more ambitious. Those are instruments that members can already look at and try to mainstream trade into how they would raise climate ambition. Another tool, more specifically to what I spoke about, national adaptation plans. Again, it's very much within the possibility of national governments to think about how would they use trade policy in their own national adaptation plans. So these are just some very, very sort of basic ideas, but just to contribute to the discussion, and let me finish there. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Ho. As always, you are very clear, and I think your message is very clear and very useful for us. I have, we have 5 minutes, and we have one question that I think it's very important. It's from Ernesto Fernandez, that is a Costa Rican friend of us. Let me put the question in Spanish to be more quickly for me, and to have more time for your answer. It's for someone of you who wants to answer. Es sobre pesca y podrían referirse rápidamente a la prohibición de subsidios, y sí, la prohibición de los subsidios dañinos a la pesca en un acuerdo de la OMC como el que estamos negociando en este momento, podrá contribuir a la reducción de emisiones y a aumentar la resiliencia de los países en desarrollo. Who wants to answer that question?
Maybe as the WTO person, and then I can say a few words about this.
Yeah, of course, Ho.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, one thing of course, subsidies come in many different forms. So there's a question about, do these subsidies also have a link to climate change? Possibly, depending on what types of subsidies you're looking at. If these subsidies lead towards activities that increase emissions, reducing some of these subsidies or eliminating them would be a positive contribution. Another way to look at it are the oceans themselves. And I think, of course, the UNEP colleagues know a lot more about this, but I think the health of the oceans itself is a very important part of ensuring that they continue to perform a function as carbon sinks. And if subsidies are harming the oceans, removing such subsidies actually is a way of contributing towards a nature-based solution. So I think that there are two ways to look at this. They're not mutually exclusive. They possibly support each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Ho. Well, thank you for an excellent conversation. We have come to the end of this session. I want to thank everyone that has, no, it's okay. Excuse me, I have, yeah, it's okay. It's a message that we didn't have time. But I want to thank everyone that has been involved in the organization on this event, particularly the World Bank Group. My appreciation to the panelists. You are a very powerful people in these matters for their insights and valuable contributions. And to all of you that participated virtually, a big thank for your interest. We hope we can take back important elements to believe that there are reasons to be optimistic and that together we can overcome this crisis. Thank you so much. Have a very good day, afternoon, or evening. It depends who you were. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.